I love that piece because it reminds me just a little that there's a chance we can all work together. I think that was kind of the point of it. But my goodness gracious, things are starting to get real, aren't they? In our country, in the world, really. Everybody trying to find their way through this crisis, some people doing better than others. It's easy for us to think that we're the ones that are doing well and the other people are doing poorly, but that's not true. We're all struggling our way through. It's a time when it's required of us to be formed more in the character of the one who's living out love within us. That's why we begin our time together with examine, looking at our own lives, looking at the way we love or don't love. Now, oftentimes when people begin to examine their own lives, they can be pretty hard on themselves. You know, you look at the things you don't like about yourself and you kind of beat yourself up and put yourself down. And, I think the idea is just, to make yourself pull it together, you know, pull yourself up and do the things you're supposed to do. Of course, we would never treat our friends that way. We'd never demand of them to instantly change like that. No, we would treat our friends with some compassion. And the reality is that that's the only way we change. I mean, you want a recipe for not changing, for continuing to do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results? Beat up on yourself. Examine your life and try and put yourself down. That's not going to work. What's going to work is for you to open yourself up and recognize that you are loved and cared for, that you in fact live in the arms of a God that seeks to make you more whole. That's why we examine. So we do so in a sense of self-compassion, a recognition that we are worthy of love. Research tells us that's what works. Come to think of it, the Apostle Paul said that too. So I invite you to a time of examine, a time to look at your life and ask yourself, how are you responding? Where's your level of fear? Maybe you thought some things last week that you wanted to try and apply in your life this week. How'd that go? And don't pay attention to that because you're interested in judging yourself, but because you're interested in recognizing it so that you can heal and grow. That's why we do this. So I invite you to a time of examine to get to the reasons behind the things that are happening in your life that are hard, where fear has taken hold. I wonder if you could sense the presence of the one that loved you as you went through that exercise. It's not always easy to do. Sometimes we need to hear that word of encouragement from someone else. And that's why this is what I want to say to you. Whatever burden weighs you down, whatever flaw, whatever tragedy has befallen you, whatever you think you've done or left undone, it matters not. Because the creative love of the divine is expressing itself in you and as you and through you. You are valuable and loved, most certainly forgiven and drawn towards a new version of yourself that will express this love more and more clearly. May the warmth and the presence of the love of God fill your heart this day and always. I'd like to read from the Gospel of Matthew. Some folks don't understand why I bother to read a 2,000-year-old document, but I consider it to be part of maybe a 4,000 or 5,000-year-old conversation that's pointing the way towards our ability to express this creative power, urgency, and love of God into the world. It was written at a particular time in that conversation, and so of course it uses symbols and language and images that fit the worldview of the time. But I think we do well to look back to it and see if it might set a direction for us. So I invite you to listen to this word from the Spirit of God. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. You remember last week, Jesus, the risen Jesus, told the women to tell the disciples to meet him in Galilee. And when they saw Jesus, they worshiped him, but some of them doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, to the end of the age." We have arrived at the end of the world. Now finally we can construct a new one. It's our chance right now to reform ourselves as spiritual, scientific, and ethical beings. My friend Zach Stein wrote that in a wonderful article in Insight. You can look it up on the web or write to me and I'll send you a link if you'd like. But I'm wondering if you've caught any glimpses of that new creation, that new world we're looking to build over these last weeks. I know I have. You can see it in little ways. There's a wonderful woman in our town who owns a pet shop and walks dogs for a living, and a lot of folks aren't having her do that now. And so there are 3 or 4 folks in that community of people who've decided to just go ahead and pay her for the rest of the year. Oh, she'll pay it back somewhere along the line, but it's a recognition that that's the situation for her. People are making an effort to do takeout at restaurants because we recognize that those businesses need our support. But more than that is the enormous and incredible cooperation I've seen as everybody locks down, socially isolates. It's not all out of fear, it's out of a sense of, I don't know, responsibility. Spoken to some young people this week who aren't really worried about the virus for themselves at all, but their cooperation comes from their desire not to infect other people. They recognize that they're part of a larger community and they need to fit in. That's a glimpse of that newly constructed kind of world. I even see it in Congress. I mean, the relief package that was passed, while apparently insufficient for the time and more will be needed, was enormous. And it was a tacit admission of everybody, Democrats and Republicans, that government has a place, that all the people need to pull together and find ways to stabilize our economy, or none of us will do well. Yeah, I see glimpses of it, but it's been predictable that the backlash has really begun. We're seeing the protests and the anger, seeing people defy requests or orders to socially isolate, people who aren't caring so much about other people because they're afraid. I understand that. They're afraid of a lot of things. They're afraid to lose their livelihoods. They're afraid of what happens next. I mean, for goodness sakes, we're in this for the long haul. This lockdown is the shock, sure, but we're going to be doing a dance with this virus for a year or 2. Who knows, maybe even longer. We're going to have to pull back and go out. Different parts of the economy will be able to start and other parts won't. People are going to be caught up in that mess. So it makes sense to be afraid. I understand that. And then how does government act? What kind of orders does it pursue? There's good reason to protest some of these lockdown orders. There's fear that our civil liberties will be encroached upon, and I get that. We'll be much better off if people adhere to those orders because they believe it's the cooperative and right thing to do, and not out of fear of the government coercing them into doing something. But in order to achieve that kind of cooperation in the face of this kind of fear over this much time, we're going to need to reform our spiritual, scientific, and ethical character. We're going to need to develop what I'm calling a greater spiritual infrastructure in each one of our lives and within all of our communities. It's the only way that we're going to be able to move towards that new world that we've been glimpsing. It's always sort of been there. I mean, that piece that I played right before the beginning of this service shows cooperation all over the world. People have been reaching for this. But it's not going to come naturally to us unless we start to think differently about ourselves and why we're here. What's going on? That's what happens in the midst of chaos. We get to start to reform the way we look at things. That's what was going on in this Gospel of Matthew. You know, people focus on the idea that it's a story about Jesus, and Jesus said this and Jesus said that. And okay, that's fine. But Matthew wrote it, probably 50, 60 years after Jesus died. He wrote it to a community that was in the midst of enormous chaos. The very center of their spiritual lives, center of much of their economic life, had been annihilated by the Roman government. The temple was destroyed. Understand, they thought God lived in that building up there. What did it mean that it was destroyed and that they couldn't do the things they used to do to give life its structure, its meaning, it's brought its communal focus in together? Now, Matthew wrote this story about Jesus at that time because he sought to tell those people what it was that they needed to do to build a new world, to take advantage of this moment, of this chance to reform their spiritual, perhaps not their scientific, but their ethical character, so that we could all express the love of God more clearly. That's the project of these scriptures, of this 4,000-year-old conversation. So he told this story, and we're on this mountain at the end of it. The thing is, Matthew took us to the mountain 3 other times in the story, and those 3 times give us a real clue as to the kinds of things that are necessary to rebuild a spiritual infrastructure within our own hearts and communities. First time he's on the mountain is during the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is talking about forming the ethical character of a community. What does it look like? It comes down to love, but love is one of those tricky words that it can mean just about anything to anybody. I mean, it's kind of a Rorschach test. But when I say it, I'm talking about a dance between seeing what's in the world and wanting to put value into it, wanting to rebuild it, almost an artistic endeavor, and enjoying what's there. This give and take, this dance that gives life its juice. That's the first time Jesus went to the mountain, was to do that. Second time he went to the mountain was to pray. I've been teasing my father for years when he tells me he's never meditated. My dad, the preacher, and that's of his generation, and that's okay. But, Jesus didn't go up on that mountain all night long and talk to God for hours at a time. No, Jesus was connected to and formed in the Spirit of God that night. In the flow of, allowing that love to express itself through him, that's what he was about that night. And following that night on the mountain is this wonderful little story, and I don't take it literally. I don't think you should either, but you can if you want. It's a wonderful story of Jesus walking on the water. Understand, in the Jewish tradition, the water is the chaos that can swallow us up. And Jesus is just walking on the surface of the water, as though he can take that chaos and make something controlled out of it. Even invites Peter out onto the water to walk with him. He failed, but that's another story. The third time Jesus went up to the mountain, he went up to heal. So with a formed character, having connected to the presence of God so that the power of God's love can work through us, Jesus then did the work of healing the community. What would it look like if we did that? If we found ourselves formed in the love and the character of God, that's why we do this exercise at the beginning of each of these gatherings. Seek that way to express the love of God more clearly. We'll talk in the future about what it might mean to pray and to draw on the strength and power of the creative force of God. What would it be if we did those things and then began to heal? Then began to, express love even in the midst of conflict. To find the good in everyone, even Donald Trump, and fan that flame. Let it live and let it glow. What would that be like? Well, he went up on the mountain one more time, and he had only one thing to say. Go out and gather a community, start a movement, make something happen. That's what's going to build the spiritual infrastructure of our large community. Is if we go out and we make something happen, if we share these words of wisdom that have been pointing this direction for thousands of years. My tradition, sure, in the Jewish tradition, yes, in many other traditions. You dig down deep and you find it's about expressing the creative dynamic of God into the world. 4 things. An ethical formation, reaching out so that we can express the love of God, connecting to, drawing from the power of God because we can't get it done alone. Doing the work that we need to do in the healing in an effort to reshape our culture, and then gather the community around, start a movement, make it happen so that more and more and more people are doing exactly what we're trying to do. Can you see it? Can you picture it? Maybe it's just in a small way. Maybe you just see a group in your living room that's working towards these ends. Friends that can share with you the desire to build a new world. Maybe it'll be people going into the current religious institutions. They're impoverished and they're embattled. They need new life from people. Can you picture it? Those communities being transformed so that there's greater connection to God, greater life, greater commitment. Most of them are moving in the right direction. Can you see, the media starting to offer images of people with spiritual infrastructure instead of caricatures of the nonsense what preachers look like on TV. Cringe every time they show a preacher on TV. Can you picture it? A movement growing. It requires you. For the world to become complete, to be at peace, but not just kind of that absence of conflict peace, but the Hebrew kind of peace, the wholeness. For a world to move there, you and I need to do the work. We need to write the blog post that says, no, we can't hate like that. We need to encourage. We need to invite. We need to spread the word. God's counting on it. The time is now. No time for delay. It's time to brace our feet on the rock of ages and swing this unwilling world around. Because a new world will emerge. What it looks like depends, at least in part, on people like you. Is there anything you feel like sharing right now? I've been telling Barbara that my theory is that we have to know each other a little bit better before we can do substantive sharing, but if there's anything on your mind you want to put in the chat box, I'll read it out. Let's move then to a time of prayer. Prayer is a tricky thing. You know, if we don't believe in the magic God, the one that's up there that we, make deals with or ask for favors, that sort of thing. If we don't see God that way, then prayer becomes a funny thing. Of course, we can connect in that sense of I am. You know, that can feel right. But there's also a sense in which we can be in the flow with, and I think impact, the movement of the creative power of God, expressing our desires to the universe, if you will. So I invite you to a time to reach out, be formed in, and caught up in the outflow of God's amazing creative love. Well, let me conclude first with something that might seem a little funny, but I love all of you. I care what happens to you. So this is my own little way of expressing it. Go out into the world, sure in the knowledge that the love of God is expressing itself in you and as you and through you. You are gorgeous, wonderful people. And God's just waiting for that love to burst forth in new and creative ways. And so go and create peace, go in peace. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God, Mother of us all. I'll see you next week. Or maybe after this song, I, by the way, got a request for the same one as last week. And so we can get together and know each other a little better. I love you all.